Welcome back to the second part of the summary video for the activity and temperature chapter. The first six videos were covered in the first chapter, and the next six videos are covered in this chapter. So I'll start with the first one of the second video, which is outline the role of the nervous system in detecting and responding to environmental change. So what role does the nervous system have when it comes to detection and response? So here I've got the similar diagram to the last video. We've got the heat being picked up by a receptor. That's detection. Right? So that detection phase was when the heat temperature was picked up by a receptor, and the receptor is part of the nervous system. So that's the first part of the nervous system that's responsible for the detection. So the receptor is part of the nervous system. Then that signal gets sent down from the receptor via a nerve to the brain. And nerves are also part of the nervous system. So again, another part that the nervous system plays in detection and response. Now the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that deals with regulation of body temperature. That was the control center. And again, it's also part of the nervous system. So the brain or the hypothalamus are both part of the nervous system. From there, another nerve, so again, the nervous system, sends that signal, in this case of thermoregulation. If we have too high temperatures, it sends it from the brain to the sweat gland. The sweat gland is an effector. That is not a part of the nervous system. The sweat gland and the sweat, so the effector and the response, are not part of the nervous system. But if we have a summary of it, the receptor, the nerves that send the signal from receptor to brain, and the nerves that send the signal from the brain to the sweat gland, they're all part of the nervous system. So what role does the nervous system have when it comes to detecting and responding to change? It plays a vital role in both detection and response. Without the nervous system, we wouldn't have homeostasis occurring. So that's the first video. Now comes process information, analyze information from secondary sources, and use available evidence to develop a model of a feedback mechanism. So we have to basically show how homeostasis, how that happens, and just draw a diagram as well. So here, this is a very colorful diagram. I'll go through step by step what's actually happening. So you imagine we have our normal body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius to begin with. Then it can either decrease or it can increase. So decreasing to 36 or increasing to 38. And remember, if it's decreasing or increasing from normal state, that's called the stimulus. Change from normal state, that's the stimulus. So then we go, and then that gets picked up by receptor. So either if it's too low or if it's too high, that's the receptor that picks it up. And the receptor was responsible for detection. So either if it's too low or too high, the same thing happens. Receptors pick up that change, the stimulus. Then that signal gets sent from the receptor to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus was responsible for thermoregulation, and that was the control center. So the part of that whole mechanism that deals with the information and tells the body what to do. So the hypothalamus, and that part of the brain, sends that message to the effector. And remember, the effector was the part that will deal the response, that will activate the response, whatever the response is. But the response is different depending on if it's too high or too low. So if our temperature has decreased, so if we want to bring it back up to 37, then we start shivering and our blood vessels constrict. Those two responses, so these are the responses in pink. And that will bring it back from 36 back to 37, so then it's normal. But on the other side, if it's increased, if it's too high, then obviously we won't shiver because then the element should make it higher. But we will want to decrease it, so what we do is we sweat and our blood vessels dilate, and those are the responses. And then it brings it back to 37 degrees Celsius. So just kind of have a gist of what that diagram is all about. You might have to memorize one of those diagrams, but if you understand it, it's going to be a lot easier to be able to memorize it as well. Next point was identify the broad range of temperatures over which life is found compared with the narrow limits for individual species. You can imagine this here as a optimum graph in terms of enzyme activity compared to temperature. And for each of these three graphs, I've got a 10 degrees or 0 degrees here, which is the minimum, 0 degrees here, up to 70, 80 plus. But depending on where that enzyme is, so an enzyme which is in the Arctic, which is that first one, its optimum ideal level is actually going to be roughly 0 degrees Celsius. So it works best at 0 degrees Celsius. It's not going to work well either too low from that or too high. So at 30 degrees Celsius, it's not going to work at all anymore. But its ideal state is 0 degrees Celsius. Whereas the enzyme that we might be able to find in the rainforest, that might have an ideal temperature of around about 37-ish degrees. So that's what we would find in our body as well. Whereas an enzyme that we find in hot springs, it's going to be accustomed to really high temperatures. So it actually works best in a 70 plus degrees Celsius. And if you go too low or too high from that 70 degrees, it's going to be working less efficiently, right? So identify the broad range of temperatures over which life is found. So we can find some enzymes in so the Arctic bacteria might have enzymes that work in 0 degrees. The rainforest bacteria might have enzymes that work in 37. And hot springs have enzymes that work in 70 degrees Celsius. So we have a huge range of species that we can find in terms of what temperatures they can survive. But we also have to compare with the narrow limits for individual species. So even though we can find different species in different areas, different temperatures, we won't be able to go and take that Arctic enzyme and put it into the hot spring environment and make it survive, because it's going to be able to survive 0 degrees, but take it out from that optimum area, the narrow limit, and it's going to start dying, right? Its enzyme is going to be denatured if it goes to anything well above 10 degrees, for example, right? So yes, we can find a huge range of them, but each specific species has a narrow limit for which area it can survive in. So Arctic bacteria can't survive in a rainforest environment or in a hot springs environment, and vice versa. Next one is compare responses of named ectothermic and endothermic organisms to changes in the ambient temperature, and explain how these responses assist in thermoregulation. Again, remember ambient temperature, that was the outside temperature. Ambient means outside. First, we need to know what an endotherm and ectotherm was. An endotherm was something that can maintain its own internal environment. So endotherms do homeostasis, and with homeostasis they can keep a constant internal environment. And we've got mammals and birds as the two classes of animals that are endotherms. Whereas ectotherms, whatever the ambient temperature is, so whatever the outside temperature is also their internal temperature. So they don't do homeostasis. And they are also known as cold-blooded animals, but that's a bit of an outdated term. But whatever their outside temperature is also inside temperature. And we've got reptiles, insects, amphibians, and fish as the classes that are these ectotherms. We've got two, so we need to have Australian examples. I have the red kangaroo as the Australian endotherm. Red kangaroo is a mammal. When its temperature is too high, when this body temperature has gone too high, then its blood vessels will dilate. We don't only have to name the adaptation, but we also have to name how that helps. So explain how these responses assist thermoregulation. So if our blood vessels dilate, then more heat will reach arms, legs, and the head, and it can actually evaporate. So the heat can be lost at the arms, legs, and head. Right? So if our blood vessels dilate, which means we lose more heat at our arms, legs, and head. That's why for the mammal, its blood vessels will dilate. It also licks its paw, so that's the adaptation. And the reason why it does it is because that water that it's licking means that the water will evaporate. And when it evaporates, that means there's going to be more heat lost. Evaporation cools us down, right? So those two are the responses you can remember for the red kangaroo when its temperature is too high. And when its temperature is too low, so it wants to increase the temperature again, then it hops around more, so it just starts doing more activity. The reason why is because that increases its heat production. Also, its blood vessels will constrict, and the reason why is because it will lose less heat if its blood vessels constrict, less heat to the outside. So it's going to go and want to keep all that heat in the organs, not at the arms or legs or head. We've got the blue-tongued lizard as our ectothermic example. When its temperature is too high outside, it seeks shelter, so it just hides somewhere. And it's controlled exposure. That means it's going to show only parts of its body. So that's when it's too hot outside. And when it's too cold outside, it's going to bask in the sun. So it's going to go do some sunbathing to get more warmth happening. And it will also seek shelter to avoid that heat as well. Right? So as you can see, the blue-tongued lizard, its responses are all external. So it's just going to use the environment to control its own temperature. It can't do internal regulation, like blood vessels dilating or blood vessels constricting, like the endotherm can. So to remember these two examples, remember a couple of their responses and why they do it as well. Next was identify some responses of plants to temperature change. I'm not going to go through all of those responses in detail, I've covered them in the video number 11. But these are some of them. So if it's too cold, what they can do is delayed seed germination. I'll go over that example. So this was when the seed is just normal. What happens when the seed germinates is that you have that small plant coming out. So this is germination. And when it's too cold, the plant will actually stay in its normal. It stays like this if it's too cold. And the reason why is it needs to have its enzymes working for it to grow properly. And if it tries to grow when it's too cold, its enzymes won't work properly and it'll just die. So it's going to wait. It's going to wait until it becomes warmer and then it will germinate. So delayed means just waiting. It's going to wait until the temperature is right. Broad leaves. So I'm going to compare broad and narrow leaves. So you imagine this is a broad leaf. So it's broad here. That is broad compared to this. That's narrow. And if you have the sun, if you have a broad leaf, that means you're going to have more sun exposure. You can have more sun hitting that leaf, which means you're going to have more warming up happening. So if it's too cold, the leaf wants to warm up, so it's going to have a lot of warmth this way. Whereas if it's narrow, then it has less sun. So that's good if it wants to avoid to have too much warmth or too much sun. Non-shiny leaves as well, that means it's going to make sure it absorbs all the heat. If it's too warm, it's going to have vertical hanging leaves. I'm going to explain that in the next part. It's going to have narrow leaves, so like this. The reason why is because it has narrow leaves. That means it's going to be less heat that it absorbs. It's going to stay a bit cooler compared to broad leaves. It's going to have reflective leaves. So reflective leaves are just leaves where you have the sun hitting but then reflecting off. Moving leaves, so it's going to move away from the sun to make sure that they move every day towards away from the sun to make sure that they don't get full sun exposure. And leaves that can curl up, so that was the spinifex. And then the parts that curled up don't get exposed to the sun as well. And then you would have done this one as well. And this is similar to the last one. So describe adaptations and responses that have occurred in strain organisms. Remember, organisms mean just living things. So we need to talk about animals and plants that assist in temperature regulation. So just remember the enotherm and the ectotherm, red kangaroo and blue-tongued lizard. I'm not going to go over their adaptations again because I went over them just a couple of minutes ago. But yeah, this you can always remember the plant one as well because you need to have the enotherm, ectotherm, and plant example. The plant was the eucalyptus tree. So the eucalyptus tree has two adaptations to allow it to reduce water temperature, because it obviously lives in Australia, so it's going to be quite warm. So first was the whole that it has a narrow leaf, so this means it's going to be less sun hitting, and it's going to be less warming up happening. Less warming up. And the other one was a vertically hanging leaf. So if you imagine the sun being here, if it's hanging like this, that means the sun will will only hit the top parts, and the bottom part won't be affected. So less exposure, like it only exposes parts of its leaves to the sun. That also means less warming up as well. So for plants, remember eucalyptus tree, and maybe remember those two examples. You can remember any other ones you want. It's completely up to you, but make sure you remember one strain, enotherm, ectotherm, and a plant, and remember their adaptations as well and why they do it. So those are the key important parts. So I hope that helped.